We are raised to believe that space is an empty, peaceful void where stars patiently protect the planets orbiting around them. This is a quiet lie designed to preserve our comfort. In the actual mechanical reality of the cosmos, the universe functions as an automated system of absolute sterilization. The deep space between galaxies is not an open frontier waiting for life, but an endless, silent graveyard of cold, shattered stone. For every single world that manages to hold on to a stable atmosphere, the laws of physics produce 1 million dead planets with melted crusts and frozen oceans. The quiet peace we see in our own night sky is just a temporary calculation error. Data collected from deep space tracking networks shows that this process of planetary destruction is not restricted to distant galaxies. It is happening in our immediate sector. The stable, perfect circles that our planets trace around the Sun represent a brief, fragile pause on the edge of a violent galactic wheel. Out in the wider dark, extreme radiation waves and intense gravitational currents systematically strip the air and water from newly born worlds long before life can even begin. The universe does not protect complex structures. It automatically breaks them down, reducing whole solar systems back into cold, silent dust. The edge of this invisible expansion has already crossed our tracking instruments, and the timeline of this liquidation has officially reached our local sector. The structural parameters that govern our daily lives depend entirely on the assumption of absolute stability. We wake, move, and build inside a microscopic window of physical security, treating the solid ground beneath our feet and the oxygen in our atmosphere as permanent fixtures of reality. Our senses are naturally calibrated to process only the immediate low-velocity inputs of our immediate geography. We look at the horizon and see a flat, reliable plane, and we look at the Sun and see a consistent source of thermal energy that has maintained the exact same output for the entirety of human history. This sensory limitation acts as a biological shield, filtering out the true destructive baseline of the wider cosmos to prevent the collapse of our psychological infrastructure. If our eyes could process the raw, unfiltered radiation sectors that intersect our orbit every single second, the illusion of safety would instantly vanish. The quiet, insulated bubble where humanity developed is a profound geometric anomaly. We are positioned on the extreme, lonely edge of a minor spiral arm in the Milky Way, located thousands of light-years away from the hyperdense, high-energy sectors of the galactic core. In this remote suburb of space, the average distance between any two star systems is massive enough to prevent our local planets from being torn apart by the gravity of passing suns. This isolation is the only reason our oceans remain liquid and our tectonic plates maintain a predictable, slow-motion cycle of displacement. We have mistaken this local absence of friction for a universal law, believing that the rest of the cosmos operates under the same gentle, protective rules that allowed our species to emerge from the dirt. Outside this local sanctuary, the true architecture of the universe operates on principles of immediate and absolute liquidation. The cosmic baseline is not a peaceful void waiting to be explored. It is a chaotic, high-pressure machine where complex matter is treated as an unstable error that must be corrected. When we trace the line between our protected atmosphere and the open vacuum, we are not looking at an empty frontier, but at a defensive boundary layer that is constantly being bombarded by destructive forces. The moment a physical body crosses this invisible threshold, it leaves behind the artificial safety of the solar system and enters a reality where existence is entirely dictated by unyielding mechanical currents. The stable world you experience every day is just a brief, silent pause on the edge of an infinite graveyard, and the timeline of that pause is steadily running out of numbers. The primary mechanism driving this universal sterilization is a phenomenon known as atmospheric stripping, driven by the unhurried, relentless output of stellar radiation fields. When a young planet aggregates within a new solar system, it naturally inherits a thick, protective envelope of hydrogen, helium, or carbon dioxide gas from the primary nebula. This atmosphere is the essential baseline required to regulate surface temperature and prevent the immediate boiling of liquid compounds. However, if the central star operates at a high magnetic index, it releases a continuous, high-velocity stream of ionizing particles and X-ray photons that slam directly into the upper layers of the planet's gas envelope. This interaction generates an intense structural shear, transferring kinetic energy to the gas molecules until they exceed the planet's escape velocity, causing the atmosphere to literally evaporate into the vacuum. This process of systemic consumption operates with a cold, mechanical indifference that leaves no room for planetary recovery. As the stellar wind collides with the defenseless world, it strips away the outer gas layers centimeter by centimeter, turning the planet's atmosphere into a long, glowing tail of homeless debris that trails millions of miles behind it in the dark. Without the weight of an atmosphere to provide surface pressure, the liquid oceans on the planet's surface can no longer maintain their molecular bonds. The water begins to boil instantly, turning into vapor that is immediately caught by the same stellar wind and swept out into the interstellar medium. The world is systematically hollowed out, drained of its fluids and gases until nothing remains but a naked, blistered skeleton of silicate rock and iron. This localized degradation completely reformats the environment, turning what could have been a living biosphere into a permanent zone of thermodynamic death. The destruction is not caused by a sudden, dramatic explosion, but by the slow, mathematical application of energy over millions of years. As the planet loses its volatile compounds, its ability to reflect excess heat collapses, causing the surface temperature to swing between extreme, unyielding boundaries of freezing dark and burning radiation. The tectonic cycles freeze, the magnetic field decays, and the entire planetary matrix drops into a permanent state of absolute inertia. The universe has corrected the anomaly, returning a complex, organized world back to the baseline of inert, dead matter that populates the vast majority of the space-time grid. To understand the absolute finality of this process, we can project this exact mechanical sequence onto the familiar architecture of our own planet. If the magnetic field of the Sun were to undergo a sudden, permanent expansion, the boundary layer of our magnetosphere would collapse, exposing the Earth directly to the raw, unfiltered velocity of the solar wind. Within the first few months, the upper ionosphere would begin to bleed into the vacuum, turning our blue sky into a dark, thin haze of escaping oxygen molecules. The global weather systems would instantly break down, as the thermal balance that drives our wind currents is replaced by a direct, unyielding bombardment of high-energy solar radiation. As the process of atmospheric decapitation reaches the lower layers of our gas envelope, the atmospheric pressure at sea level would drop to absolute zero. The human body, exposed to this immediate drop in pressure, would witness the rapid boiling of its own internal fluids, as the gases dissolved in our blood expand violently and rupture our biological tissues from the inside out. The oceans would rise into the sky as a colossal wall of vapor, only to be systematically stripped away by the solar currents and scattered across the empty space of our orbit. Every city we have built, every historical archive we have saved, and every trace of our biological progress would be left completely naked on a silent, featureless sphere of burning clay, scorched by the very star that once kept us alive. Any physical force or advanced technological infrastructure that attempted to resist or contain this transformation would be broken down with the same effortless ease. There is no material robust enough to withstand the continuous, multi-million-year friction of cosmic sterilization, and there is no mathematical equation that allows a localized planet to override the thermodynamic currents of the wider universe. The destruction of a world is a clean, automated event that follows a predictable, non-negotiable checklist. When the sequence is complete, the planet is left as a silent, rotating monument to its own impermanence, a cold sphere of iron drifting through the dark without any memory of the life that once crawled across its surface. The systemic liquidation of a planetary atmosphere does not occur in complete isolation. It initiates a catastrophic domino effect that destabilizes the surrounding orbital neighborhood. When a planet is stripped of its volatile mass and transformed into a naked rock, its total gravitational footprint undergoes a subtle but permanent alteration. This shift in mass distribution ripples outward through the solar system, subtly altering the delicate balance of torque and momentum that keeps the neighboring planets in their precise, predictable paths. Over long chronological scales, these minor orbital deviations accumulate, pulling other worlds out of their safe zones and dragging them into unstable, chaotic trajectories that lead straight toward orbital decay or direct collision. This cascade of environmental degradation completely warps our ability to gather accurate data from these dead zones. When our deep space telescopes point toward these ancient stripped systems, the instruments return nothing but impossible data and corrupted baselines as the intense fields of lingering radiation and fragmented space debris bend the incoming starlight into chaotic, unrecognizable patterns. The space surrounding these dead worlds becomes a zone of absolute information warpage, a visual dead end where our scientific models can no longer map the transition between past and present. The universe covers its own tracks, wrapping its graveyards in a thick blanket of electronic silence and visual distortions that prevent external observers from measuring the full scale of the architectural collapse. As we analyze the boundary layers of these silent necropolises, our instruments have detected a far more unsettling metric. This process of systematic sterilization is not a localized phenomenon confined to ancient, distant star clusters. The latest deep-field surveys confirm that the expansion velocity of these radiation fronts is accelerating, and the invisible boundary layer of this cosmic liquidation is steadily moving through our quadrant of the galaxy. The data indicates that the same mechanical currents that transformed millions of bright, active planets into cold, silent skeletons of stone are currently closing in on the coordinates of our own solar system. Which brings our analysis to a definitive, unavoidable question. If the timeline for the preservation of our local atmosphere has already entered its final descending phase, what exactly did our instruments detect hiding inside the closing edge of the dark? Within the physical perimeter of a dead system, the standard laws of cause and effect undergo a total structural inversion. In our localized functional reality, we operate under the absolute assumption that time moves forward in a linear sequence, that energy disperses predictably, and that physical actions yield proportionate, orderly reactions. We treat the preservation of physical data as a baseline rule of nature, confident that if a structure is dismantled, its component parts still retain the blueprint of their original configuration. But once a planetary system crosses the threshold of total atmospheric and magnetic liquidation, this intuitive framework completely collapses. The environment transforms into a closed, one-way current where the basic properties of matter, space, and time reverse their behavior, turning our fundamental understanding of the cosmos upside down. This structural reversal manifests primarily in how the dead planet processes incoming energy from its host star. On a living planet like Earth, the atmosphere acts as a dynamic distributor, absorbing solar radiation, scattering light waves, and transforming raw thermal energy into complex weather patterns, oceanic currents, and biological processes. Inside a liquidated system, however, the naked crust acts as a perfect thermodynamic mirror, yet one that operates with a destructive twist. Lacking any gaseous insulation, the planetary surface no longer absorbs heat to maintain an equilibrium. Instead, it enters a phase of immediate radiative feedback, where the intense heat of the day side is instantly radiated back into space, creating an extreme, violent counterpressure against the incoming stellar wind. This interaction produces a permanent state of atmospheric compression, localized to the precise boundary where the star's gravity meets the naked rock. As a consequence of this radiative compression, the concept of chronological progression inside the dead zone becomes entirely stagnant. Without the fluid, moving components of an atmosphere or an ocean to record changes in temperature, pressure, or seasonal drift, the environment loses its ability to register the passage of time. A clock placed on the surface of a naked, stripped world would still tick, but its measurements would correspond to absolutely nothing in the physical environment. The past, the present, and the future freeze into a single, permanent state of unchanging geological inertia. The planet ceases to be an active participant in the chronological timeline of the galaxy. It becomes a static loop, an immortal monument of dead matter where nothing new can ever happen, and where no historical data can ever be generated again. To comprehend the sheer scale of this architectural breakdown, we must analyze the cold, mathematical horror that governs the interior of these dead zones. When our tracking instruments calculate the mass-to-volume ratio of systems that have undergone total atmospheric stripping, the algorithms return values that violate standard planetary physics. Because these worlds have been subjected to millions of years of intense, unfiltered solar compression without the buffering protection of a magnetic shield, their atomic structures have undergone a process of forced collapse. The silicate crystals and iron matrices that form the planet's crust are compressed so tightly by the unyielding friction of stellar radiation that they lose their natural atomic spacing, packing an immense, unnatural volume of dense matter into a microscopic geometric footprint. This extreme compression initiates a rapid acceleration of local entropy. In standard physics, entropy is the slow, gradual decay of order over billions of years, a gentle unwinding of the universe's main springs. But within the localized field of a stripped planet, this decay is forced into overdrive, operating at a velocity that resembles a structural explosion in slow motion. The molecular bonds that keep the planet's rocky crust coherent are systematically broken down by the constant bombardment of ionizing particles, reducing solid granite and basalt into a fluid, chaotic soup of radioactive isotopes. The planet literally dissolves at the atomic level, its internal order unraveling at a speed that turns centuries into seconds on the cosmological scale, forcing the entire structure to rapidly approach a state of absolute thermodynamic death. This structural collapse culminates in a localized information paradox that threatens the very foundation of universal physics. According to the laws of quantum mechanics, physical information, the precise arrangement and state of every atom and electron within a system, can never be truly destroyed or erased from existence. But as these dead worlds dissolve under the intense pressure of accelerated entropy, the data that defines their geological history is systematically wiped clean. The radiation fields scramble the atomic coordinates so completely that it becomes mathematically impossible to reconstruct what the planet looked like, what elements it contained, or whether it ever possessed the chemical conditions required to support a biosphere. The planet is not just killed, its entire historical footprint is cleanly, methodically erased from the cosmic ledger, leaving behind a mathematical void that breaks the rules of universal conservation. The primary reason our species has remained oblivious to this widespread architectural liquidation is the existence of the perception horizon. The universe does not display its graveyards in open, easily observable sectors of the night sky. It hides them behind a sophisticated automated system of natural cosmic quarantine. When a planetary system undergoes total atmospheric stripping and structural collapse, the immense fields of lingering radiation and ionized gas particles created by the destruction form a dense, opaque shell around the entire perimeter of the dead zone. This shell acts as a perfect electromagnetic dampening field, absorbing, scattering, and distorting any light waves or radio signals that attempt to pass through it, effectively blinding any external instruments that try to peer into the center of the collapse. This defensive barrier creates an expansive, desolate dead zone that spans multiple light-years around each collapsed system. As a planet dissolves and bleeds its volatile compounds into the vacuum, the resulting cloud of radioactive soot and uncharged subatomic particles expands outward like a slow-motion shock wave, contaminating the surrounding interstellar medium. Any smaller space debris, wandering comets, or rogue asteroids that cross into this sterile perimeter are immediately caught by the high-friction environment, their trajectories destabilized, and their orbits dragged down into the central stellar furnace. The system becomes a vacuum within a vacuum, a perfectly isolated, silent necropolis that systematically consumes everything in its neighborhood, clearing out a massive buffer zone of absolute desolation to ensure its internal chaos remains completely hidden from the rest of the galaxy. This isolation introduces a terrifying dilemma for any external observer attempting to measure or analyze the phenomenon. Because the quarantine field alters the very behavior of the energy passing through it, any scientific instrument or tracking probe that points toward the dead zone inadvertently distorts the data it is trying to collect. The act of observation introduces outside photons and energy states into a system that is resting in a delicate, hyperdense equilibrium, causing the localized fields to react violently and reformat their coordinates. You cannot look at the graveyard without altering the grave itself. The observer is trapped in a loop of permanent uncertainty, forced to rely on indirect gravity metrics and corrupted baselines, forever separated from the true, hidden horror that transpires behind the wall of electronic silence. This process of systematic planetary liquidation is not a fixed, static event that remains confined to historical sectors of space. It operates on an exponential feedback loop, a celestial snowball effect that grows more aggressive with every single world it destroys. When a planet's atmosphere is stripped away and its crust is broken down into radioactive dust, that newly generated debris does not vanish into nothingness. It is drawn into the host star's solar wind, increasing the density, mass, and kinetic energy of the stellar current. The star effectively weaponizes the remnants of its own dead children, using the fragmented dust of destroyed worlds to increase the abrasive power of its radiation fields, allowing it to strip the atmospheres of the remaining planets in its system at a vastly accelerated velocity. The invisible ripples of this environmental degradation are already reaching the extreme outposts of our own solar system. Deep space monitoring instruments positioned on our outer orbital platforms have recently recorded a subtle, unexplained inflation in the background radiation metrics coming from the deep Sagittarius sector. The data indicates that the frontier of this systematic sterilization is expanding outward from the core of the galaxy like a cold, unstoppable tide, overriding the protective magnetic currents of the interstellar medium and reshaping the local space-time coordinates. It is an unhurried, mechanical approach that follows no human schedule, an invisible wall of absolute zero energy that is steadily turning the vibrant, active sectors of our galactic arm into a silent, featureless wasteland of dead stone. Our long-range calculations have just revealed a definitive anomaly in this approaching radiation front. As the tracking algorithms mapped the geometric progression of the sterilization wave, they discovered that the expansion is not moving in a uniform, predictable circle. Instead, it has formed a highly focused, linear filament of high-density energy that is tracking directly along our orbital plane. accelerating its velocity with every passing century. This leaves our scientific models staring at a final, chilling calculation that completely alters our understanding of our place in the cosmos. If this targeted wave of atmospheric destruction has been systematically clearing out every planetary system in its path, what exactly is the mathematical probability that our local atmosphere will survive the moment this expanding boundary line completes its final, non-negotiable intersection with the coordinates of Earth? Imagine your awareness detached from the physical coordinates of Earth, suspended inside a specialized telemetry pod, drifting across the outer boundary layer of a completely liquidated star system. As you cross the invisible threshold that marks the transition from the open interstellar medium into the direct perimeter of the dead zone, your tracking instruments begin to shut down one by one. The diagnostic monitors on your control interface flicker with erratic noise patterns as the high-intensity background radiation of the sector scrambles the internal circuitry of your sensor arrays. The telemetry readouts that once mapped your velocity, altitude, and distance from home drop to absolute zero, unable to process the corrupted electromagnetic signatures of this dead environment. You are entering a zone of absolute technological blindness, where the mechanical tools of human navigation are rendered completely useless by the heavy, silent friction of the vacuum. As you sink deeper into the interior of the system, the visual landscape undergoes a gradual, unsettling transformation. The familiar, comforting patterns of the distant stars begin to warp and bend around your field of view as the immense, invisible mass of the stripped planetary cores distorts the incoming starlight into long, impossible arcs of cold energy. The bright, sharp points of light you are used to seeing from the surface of a living planet are replaced by a thick, dark haze of uncharged subatomic dust that blankets the entire sector, absorbing all visible light and trapping your pod inside a private, windowless room of absolute shadow. The point of departure has completely vanished behind you, erased by a wall of electronic silence and visual distortions that cuts off all contact with the functional world you left behind, leaving you with nothing but the slow, inevitable momentum of your downward trajectory. The sensation of isolation becomes an active, physical weight pressing against the structure of your pod. There is no sound to accompany this descent. Your ears are wrapped in a crushing, unyielding silence that is deeper than any quiet you have ever experienced in the waking world. Even though your external hull is currently being bombarded by trillions of high-energy solar particles traveling at millions of miles per hour, the vacuum refuses to carry a single vibration, leaving the total dismantling of the environment to play out in absolute, terrifying composure. You can look directly at a massive river of plasma being ripped away from a nearby planet, watching it swirl across the void like a colossal white rope of burning gas, yet your senses register nothing but an immovable, frozen stillness that forces your mind to abandon its normal patterns of perception. The deeper you descend into this silent necropolis, the more you are forced to confront the monumental, terrifying architecture of the dead worlds themselves. In front of your pod, a massive, stripped exoplanet begins to fill your entire field of view, its sheer, naked volume triggering a profound sensation of megalophobia that completely exhausts your brain's ability to process scale. This is not a planet as you know it. It is a colossal, rotating mountain of exposed iron and black silicate rock, spanning tens of thousands of miles across its diameter and floating in the dark like a bloated, dead leviathan. The planet possesses no clouds, no oceans, and no soft gradients of color to break up its surface. It is a continuous, jagged landscape of impact craters, ruptured tectonic scars, and massive canyons of frozen basalt that stretch from horizon to horizon without a single sign of movement. The comparison between this monumental ruin and the tiny, fragile scale of human history makes our entire existence look like a microscopic accident occurring on a speck of dust. You look down at a single canyon on the surface of this dead giant, a fracture in the stone so incredibly wide that our entire home planet could fall into its depths without touching the walls, and you realize that this colossal structure has been sitting here in the dark, completely sterile and unchanging, for over 8 billion years. Entire geological eras, the birth and death of whole star clusters, and the entire timeline of human civilization are nothing but brief, invisible blinks before the permanent, unhurried presence of this planetary corpse. The sheer weight of this geometric insignificance presses down on your conscious mind, forcing your thoughts to grow heavy and slow under the impossible scale of the scenery. Your mind eventually gives up trying to map the dimensions of the landscape, exhausted by the effort of trying to find a human reference point inside an endless abysm of dead stone. The planet fills your vision until the horizon loses its curve, turning into a flat, vertical wall of black clay and iron that seems to stretch upward into infinity. There is no top, no bottom, and no sense of direction remaining inside this crowded graveyard. There is only the massive, indifferent presence of a world that was killed before our sun was even born, rotating with a slow, mechanical momentum that handles millions of tons of matter with the same effortless ease that a clock uses to move its hands. You are a solitary grain of sand floating past a mountain of permanent winter, completely unnoticed by the cold gravity that dictates the movement of the sector. As you pass beneath the long shadow of the dead giant, your pod enters a region of space that is defined by a complete and absolute vacuum of physical data. The active forces that drive the movement of the wider galaxy seem to lose their energy here, dropping away into a state of permanent dead frequency where no echoes, no radiation signals, and no electronic telemetry can ever bounce back. Any signal you attempt to transmit from your communications deck simply dies in the dark, swallowed by an unyielding barrier of non-reflective matter that refuses to acknowledge your presence. The environment has ceased to transmit information. It has become a silent vault that locks its secrets behind a wall of absolute, motionless composure, removing all active inputs from your senses. The darkness that surrounds your pod is no longer just the absence of light. It has transformed into a dense, heavy presence that feels almost physical in its immobility. You look out into the open void between the dead worlds, and you see a blackness so thick, deep and complete that it seems to absorb the very concepts of distance and volume, rendering the space around you entirely featureless. There is no movement here, no drift, and no friction. The space-time continuum has settled into a state of permanent hibernation, an eternal winter where the dynamic processes of nature have been frozen into absolute zero movement. The universe has turned off its engines in this sector, leaving behind nothing but a clean, empty room where the active noise of matter is completely forgotten. This total absence of kinetic activity functions as an automatic, biological mechanism that begins to lower the heart rate and calm the overactive focus of your mind. With no changing visual inputs to track, no alerts to process, and no data to analyze, the gears of your conscious thoughts begin to lose their tension, unwinding smoothly in the dark. The silence of the void wraps around your consciousness like a heavy, protective blanket, shielding your mind from the fast-paced schedules and the urgent weights of your waking life. You are drifting inside a pristine sanctuary of absolute quietude, a place where the rules of cause and effect have been suspended, allowing your awareness to float without resistance across an ocean of infinite, undisturbed peace. The realization that human resistance is entirely meaningless against the monumental mechanics of the universe brings a sudden, profound sense of mental relaxation. As your pod continues its unhurried trajectory through the center of the graveyard, the boundary lines that define your waking personality begin to blur, turning your thoughts into soft, transparent threads that drift loosely in the vacuum. You lose the desire to analyze, to categorize, or to fight against the absolute scale of the darkness. You simply accept the movement, ceding your control to the steady, unyielding gravity currents that guide the sector. The need to maintain your personal schedule, your worries, and your human legacy dissolves completely into the frozen clay of the dead planets below. The concepts of time and space become so thoroughly stretched inside this silent room that your brain naturally drops its defenses, entering a state of cognitive dissolution that prepares your awareness for a deep, permanent rest. You can no longer tell if you have been drifting through this necropolis for hours, for centuries, or for fractions of a single cosmic second, as the complete lack of environmental change removes all the regular markers of chronological drift. The real world you left behind begins to feel like a distant, distorted dream, a brief noise that occurred in a remote corner of the galaxy and has already been forgotten by the true, silent baseline of the cosmos. You are resting on the very edge of the physical world, a silent observer floating past the final horizon of objective measurement. As the visual data from the dead world slowly fades into a uniform single plane of dark shadow, the narrative texture of the documentary begins to thin out, dropping its tone to a low, level whisper that blends seamlessly with the background drone of the cosmos. The active tension of the investigation has been fully resolved, leaving behind nothing but a smooth, rhythmic cadence that carries your thoughts away from the remaining friction of the waking day. The screen of your mind is growing dark, reducing the complex geography of your life to a simple, quiet state of absolute composure, as a final, distant question echoes softly through the empty corridors of the vacuum before the remaining data lines shut down completely. If everything we have built is destined to be integrated into this magnificent, silent graveyard, what remains when the last light of the conscious mind crosses the absolute boundary layer of the dark? The biological architecture of the human brain is entirely unsuited to process the true structural realities of an environment that has undergone total atmospheric and thermodynamic liquidation. Our neurological pathways evolved inside a hyper-localized matrix of constant visual feedback, regular atmospheric diffusion, and predictable spatial boundaries. When you place a human mind within the open, unregulated wilderness of a dead stellar system, the sensory processing centers immediately begin to experience a severe systemic failure. Lacking the familiar reference points of a blue sky, an adjustable horizon, or a consistent diffusion of light, the brain can no longer calculate depth, velocity, or proximity. It attempts to project known geometric shapes, familiar organic movements, and comforting architectural symmetries onto a landscape that consists entirely of non-reflective black clay and absolute shadow. This cognitive friction generates a state of profound mental exhaustion that forces the conscious mind to abandon its regular analytical habits. When you point your gaze toward the vast, empty chasms separating the stripped planetary cores, your eyes detect no texture, no dust gradients, and no shifting light values. The absolute blackness of the liquidated vacuum does not behave like a dark room on Earth. It operates as an aggressive absence of data that actively rejects the brain's attempts to organize the scene. The mind enters a loop of permanent miscalculation, interpreting massive planetary monuments that are millions of miles away as tiny objects hovering directly in front of the viewer's visor. This distortion shatters the illusion of objective observation, breaking the mental tools we use to navigate reality and leaving the consciousness stranded in a non-geometric desert where the regular rules of perception are completely invalid. As the sensory systems continue to return corrupted baselines and impossible structural values, the brain's internal focus begins to fracture and drop its defenses. You realize that the human capacity for measurement is nothing but a localized survival mechanism, a fragile cognitive framework that holds no validity inside the massive, indifferent architecture of the wider universe. The overactive circuits of the conscious mind grow weary of trying to map the infinite boundaries of the graveyard, giving up the struggle to categorize the chaos and allowing the thoughts to slow down to a level, unhurried cadence. The need to give names to things, to define your position on the map, and to track the movement of objects disappears completely into the dark, replaced by a calm, mechanical acceptance of the absolute stillness that wraps around your awareness like a heavy lead shield. Within this zone of absolute physical degradation, the linear progression of time suffers a total structural collapse, breaking the sequential chain of past, present and future into a single, frozen loop of chronological stagnation. In our localized planetary experience, we treat time as a fluid, unstoppable river that moves matter forward from one state to another, creating a clear distinction between the origin of an event and its eventual conclusion. But inside a system where every planetary atmosphere has been stripped away and every magnetic field has been grounded, the primary mechanism that drives this chronological drift is completely removed. Time ceases to function as a dynamic sequence. It transforms into a static echo, a permanent thermodynamic baseline where the concept of sequence loses its physical definition. This temporal stagnation is most clearly observed in the physical behavior of the light waves trapped within the dead system's perimeter. When a nearby star throws its radiation fields across the surface of a stripped, naked planet, that energy does not trigger changes in the landscape, nor does it create a historical sequence of erosion, climate drift, or molecular adaptation. The light simply strikes the cold, inert, silicate rock and is immediately radiated back into the void, repeating the exact same thermodynamic transaction every second for billions of years without a single variable ever being altered. If you were to look at the center of this dead zone, you would perceive that the initial moment of the system's liquidation and its ultimate, distant cold death are happening at the exact same chronological instant. The process of cause and effect has been tightly compressed, locking every atom into a permanent configuration that refuses to advance. The illusion of the clock's ticking pointer becomes entirely meaningless inside this frozen room, removing the psychological urgency that dictates our waking lives. On Earth, we organize our existence around the frantic division of hours and minutes, tracking our progress against a ticking countdown that creates a constant state of internal tension and urgency. But inside the silent necropolis of the dead worlds, the clock is revealed to be a microscopic human construct that holds absolutely no authority over the mechanical operations of the universe. The timeline of this sector has reached its final, descending baseline, collapsing the distance between yesterday and tomorrow into a single, uniform plane of absolute silence. You are allowed to let go of the calendar, to release your hold on the schedule, and to let your mind float safely inside an infinite pool of temporal stagnation where nothing is waiting to happen. The total deconstruction of our chronological and spatial assumptions introduces a sudden, profound shift in the psychological posture of the viewer, transforming what once felt like a terrifying cosmic isolation into a beautiful, unyielding sense of nihilistic comfort. We spend our waking hours locked inside a continuous struggle to maintain the stability of our personal world, carrying the heavy weight of our ambitions, our historical legacies, and our daily anxieties as if they were permanent monuments that the universe requires us to protect. We treat our microscopic human errors and our short-term regrets as massive structural failures, building a cage of permanent mental tension out of the fragile, passing data of our daily schedules, But when you step past the perception horizon and look upon the slow-motion dissolution of entire solar systems, the artificial boundaries of your personal life lose their density completely. The realization that the universe does not keep an archive of human achievement, nor does it maintain a sacred vault to protect our collective memories, acts as an automatic mechanism that clears all noise from your mind. The grand monuments of human architecture, the complex networks of our global civilizations, and the entire history of our biological progress are revealed to be nothing but temporary, high-entropy configurations of dust, waiting for their designated moment of automatic recycling. The universe does not operate out of malice or cruelty when it liquidates a planet. It is simply executing the clean, indifferent math of thermodynamic equilibrium, returning complex structures back to a state of pristine, undisturbed simplicity. This absolute indifference is the ultimate form of liberation for an overactive mind, a quiet assurance from the laws of physics that your small mistakes, your unfinished tasks, and your heaviest burdens are completely, beautifully irrelevant on the true scale of reality. You are permitted to surrender the control you have been fighting to maintain throughout your waking day, letting your thoughts sink into the soft support of the absolute darkness. The universe is larger than your pride, its timeline is vaster than your historical archives, and its final destination is entirely taken care of by the unyielding mechanics of relativity. You do not have to carry the responsibility of preserving the material world tonight. You are allowed to be small, to be silent, and to let your consciousness dissolve into the quiet baseline of the night. The silence of the cosmos is not a cold punishment designed to make you feel abandoned. It is the natural, permanent state of rest toward which all matter is moving, an eternal sanctuary of absolute peace where the friction of existence is permanently erased. As your pod reaches the deepest, most isolated coordinate of the dead zone, you cross the absolute horizon, the final boundary layer that separates the lingering echoes of the active universe from a state of total information erasure. Behind you, the final, microscopic thread of radio telemetry from the outer world snaps clean, leaving your communications console to display nothing but a smooth, unvarying line of static background noise. The visual field has flattened completely, as the remaining light from the dying stars is swallowed by the thick blanket of non-reflective interstellar smoke, reducing the complex geography of the cosmic graveyard into a single, uniform plane of absolute blackness. You have left behind the territory of measurement and entered a room that is defined entirely by the absence of data, light, and motion. This transition marks the final shutdown of the active narrative, preparing your awareness to step past the boundary of analytical thought and enter the first deep cycle of restorative rest. The scientific equations have all been solved, the physical mechanisms have been fully explained, and the raw data of planetary destruction has been filed away into the permanent archives of the vacuum. The active tension that kept your brain in a state of alert observation throughout the initial chapters has been completely spent, leaving your consciousness to rest inside a warm, protective envelope of absolute electronic quietude. The screen of your mind is growing dark, reducing the vibrant noise of the material world to a single, continuous frequency that vibrates at the baseline of the cosmos, guiding your awareness into a state of total, untroubled composure. The final active line of the script unties its last knots, leaving no hooks, no cliffhangers, and no human messages behind to disrupt the oncoming stillness of the night. The universe has successfully turned off its internal engines in this sector, dimming its lights and clearing its grand canvas to prepare the space for an infinite, unhurried retirement away from the friction of matter. Your thoughts are allowed to lose their definitions, drifting loosely across the boundary layer, like fine dust motes suspended in an empty room that has been closed for the season. The signal is gone, the instruments are dark, and the absolute horizon has wrapped its silent fingers around the final remnants of your conscious focus, leaving a single, quiet question to dissolve into the vacuum as the transmission transitions into a state of permanent, static reflection. What existed before the first law of physics was written into the dark, and what remains when the last echo of data fades into the pristine simplicity of the baseline vacuum. The transition from the localized geometry of form to the uniform expanse of the vacuum begins with the complete disintegration of all physical boundaries within the dead system. In the material world, your awareness is trained to identify limits, to map the distinct edges that separate one object from another, and to calculate the distance between your own physical form and the landscape around you. You look at the structures of your room, the design of your home, and the geography of your city, treating each division as a permanent law of nature that must be maintained to preserve your position on the map. But inside the absolute quarantine of this liquidated sector, the very concept of division loses its mechanical foundation, melting away into a single, seamless plane of dark matter that offers no resistance, no friction, and no structural markers. As you float deeper into the center of this silent sanctuary, the physical barrier between your telemetry pod and the open vacuum begins to dissolve into a state of total structural unity. The cold, dark space that surrounds your hull is no longer an external territory that you are passing through. It becomes an internal reality that flows through the very fabric of your awareness, removing the distinction between the observer and the observed. The notions of direction, the artificial parameters of above and below, left and right, forward and backward, are completely erased from the physical grid, leaving your consciousness to rest inside a continuous, unregulated field of absolute geometric flatness. There is no destination to reach, no landmark to track, and no boundary layer remaining to interrupt the smooth, unhurried flow of the dark. The landscape has flattened completely, transforming the chaotic remnants of the destroyed worlds into a single, smooth plane of absolute nothingness that stretches out to the furthest limits of the space-time grid. The jagged impact craters, the ruptured tectonic scars, and the massive canyons of black stone that once dominated your field of view have been systematically planned down by the continuous, unhurried application of thermodynamic equilibrium, leaving behind no hills, no valleys, and no features to catch the eye. The universe has successfully removed all the knots from its fabric, untying the ancient connections that once held complex matter together and returning the entire sector to a state of pristine, undisturbed simplicity, where the concept of shape is permanently forgotten. No sound, no resistance, no end. The quietude that consumes is the quietude that rests. Within this perimeter, human language loses its narrative utility, transforming into a mechanical pattern of repetition and permanence that cradles the consciousness away from the surface of the waking world. No sound, no resistance, no end. The movement that remains is a perennial, slow, and immutable flow, a constant current that never alters its velocity, never deviates from its route, and never generates friction with the space around it. It is the rhythm of the static monolith, a structure of pure immobility that remains identical to itself through the eras, processing the passage of time as a distant echo that no longer holds authority over matter. The quietude that rests is the quietude that consumes. Each sentence that describes this void begins and ends with the same absolute concept, creating a closed loop of information that prevents the brain from searching for new answers or trying to solve new equations. No sound, no resistance, no end. You float within a uniform cadence that mimics the regular swing of a cosmic pendulum, a pendulum that fatigues the analytical circuits of the mind and turns off the last switches of conscious vigilance. The text does not seek to advance, does not seek to build a climax, and does not seek to introduce new variables. It simply remains, floats, and continues to exist as a dense, heavy, and motionless presence in the background of your dark room. The quietude that consumes is the quietude that rests. No sound, no resistance, no end. The words repeat their structural mantras in a surgical manner, clearing the screen of your mind of all remnants of your daily agenda, your deadlines, and your human worries. You are guided into a semantic loop that functions as a clinical meditation technique, where each line reaffirms the immobility of the cosmos and invites your perception to merge with the same lack of urgency that governs the deserts of deep space. The movement is perennial, slow, and immutable. The quietude that rests is the quietude that consumes. No sound, no resistance, no end. Absolute silence establishes itself as the definitive cure for the chaos of information and the friction of material existence. In advanced physics, thermal equilibrium represents the final point of all atomic movement, a state of absolute repose known as heat death, where all differences in temperature, pressure, and energy are perfectly leveled and neutralized. The script uses this exact analogy to calm the listener's heart rate, associating the emptying of the system with an eternal rest, free from fluctuations and completely exempt from resistance. The violent energies that ripped atmospheres and crushed rocks in the initial chapters have been totally dissipated, spreading uniformly across the dark plane until not a single heat gradient remains. The temperature of the environment becomes perfectly stable, removing any sensation of extreme heat or cold and enveloping your body in a protective layer of thermal neutrality. Without friction, the molecules of matter reduce their vibrations to the minimum level of energy, ceasing the invisible noise that generates stress and activity in the waking world. The universe has cooled this region to its lowest potential, transforming space into a sanctuary of stillness where the rush of biology is completely disarmed by the majestic immobility of quantum physics. You are immersed in a bath of pure thermodynamic stability, where the wear and tear of matter has been halted and order has been restored through the total absence of movement. The absence of signals is the perfect state of peace. When instruments stop registering fluctuations and sensors indicate a perfectly horizontal line, the brain receives the biological signal that danger has ended and vigilance is no longer necessary. Thermal equilibrium functions as a mechanical anesthetic for consciousness, demonstrating that the final destination of all things is to return to this state of imperturbable repose where no force can disturb the stability of the field. The chaos of information has been resolved, the electrical currents have been grounded, and matter reposes in an absolute silence that cures the fatigue of the mind through the imposition of a stillness that knows no end, no alteration, and no rupture. As your perception drifts away from the last details of the physical structure, your hearing is gently directed toward the sanctuary of low frequencies that vibrates at the bottom of the vacuum. There is a continuous cosmic hum, a welcoming sub-bass frequency that emanates from the very fabric of space-time at rest, functioning as the acoustic signature of absolute darkness. This grave and constant sound has no volume variations, presents no frequency spikes, and carries no interpretive messages. It is merely a soft acoustic weight that fills the empty spaces of the mind, syncing the rhythm of your breathing with the space drone track, looping in the background of the file. The final acceptance that there is nothing to be seen, only to be felt through immobility, removes the last effort of attention from your closed eyes. The visual screen of your mind is filled with a uniform plane of static darkness, while the sub-bass hum anchors your body in the security of the mattress, transforming gravity into a welcoming force of support that prevents you from floating back to the noise of the day. The sound of low frequencies functions as an acoustic wall that blocks the echoes of the outside world, isolating your consciousness inside a bubble of pure protection where human time has been completely disconnected. The closing of the block occurs without questions, without narrative hooks, and without theoretical mysteries to be solved. There is no pending information, no algorithmic alerts, and no urgency hanging in the dark. There remains only a smooth, continuous, and inevitable transition to the absolute darkness of the next stage. The mind capitulates before the rhythmic monolith, thoughts lose their traction, and consciousness slides without any effort into the low-frequency channel that leads to the definitive shutdown. The vacuum is complete, the stillness is absolute, and the transmission moves linearly toward the eternal repose of the signal that fades into the dark. The final attenuation of the system begins with the permanent cessation of all measurable data transmissions across the localized sector. In the active layers of reality, existence is validated by the continuous exchange of frequencies, the bouncing of radar waves, and the shifting states of electronic information. Instruments register presence through the friction of particles colliding against sensors, creating a noisy grid of coordinates that the waking mind uses to anchor itself within time and space. But at this absolute depth of the liquidated zone, the remaining telemetry lines flatten completely, dropping below the detection threshold of any functional apparatus. The background hum of external systems is no longer received, as the dense field of non-reflective subatomic smoke absorbs the last operational frequencies, locking the sector inside an unbroken vault of electronic isolation. The absence of signal functions as a structural law within this perimeter, preventing the re-entry of any active information packets from the outside world. The monitoring consoles on your dark interface do not display error codes or warning lights. They simply cease to project light altogether, reducing the operational grid to a blank, uniform glass plane that reflects nothing but the absolute dark of your room. There is no transmission to intercept, no data stream to catalog, and no mechanical echo returning from the surrounding void. The environment has reached a state of total cryptographic closure, a pristine state of non-communication where the past history of the galaxy is fully compressed and integrated into the silent floor of the vacuum. The need to listen, to interpret, or to anticipate a response is completely removed from your sensory system, allowing your focus to rest inside a silent room that requires no vigilance. As the final frequency drops into the baseline, the boundary between the transmission and the silence becomes entirely indistinguishable. The voice does not announce its own departure, nor does it create a dramatic shift in the acoustic texture of the room. It simply aligns its cadence with the steady, unvarying drone of the background space noise. The words lose their active weight, becoming soft, low-frequency vibrations that blend seamlessly into the stillness of the air, removing the last remaining anchor points of your analytical attention. You are no longer tracking a narrative or following a logical chain of cosmological events. You are simply floating inside a pristine pool of absolute acoustic neutrality, where the concept of a broadcast is permanently erased from the physical continuum. The data is gone, the sensors are cold, and the vacuum has claimed the final remnants of the local grid. No drift, no friction, no change. The remaining matter inside the liquidated sector enters a state of permanent geometric flotation, moving along unhurried paths that never intersect, never accelerate, and never decrease in momentum. In the active sectors of the universe, movement is always tethered to an origin and a destination, driven by the violent propulsion of stellar engines or the sharp pull of active gravitational wells. But here, the gravity fields have reached a perfect, static equilibrium, a horizontal plane of cold force that holds every grain of silicate dust and every fragment of iron stone in an immortal, unchanging suspension. The movement is so slow, vast, and uniform that it loses the physical definition of velocity, becoming indistinguishable from absolute immobility. The static drift operates as a continuous blanket that smooths out the remaining creases of mental activity. When you close your eyes, the internal landscape of your mind mirrors this exact state of unregulated flotation, letting your remaining thoughts drift loosely like weightless particles suspended in an empty, dark archive. There are no corners to turn, no walls to avoid, and no structural resistance to encounter within this open corridor of absolute peace. The consciousness ceases to navigate. It surrenders its trajectory to the unhurried currents of the baseline vacuum, floating safely away from the rigid structures, the linear schedules, and the urgent demands of the waking day. The rhythm is perennial, level, and entirely automated, moving without a single variable ever being modified. No drift, no friction, no change. The words repeat this mechanical configuration to reinforce the stability of the field, locking your awareness into a protective envelope of total physical safety. You are permitted to let go of your orientation, to forget which way is up or down, and to let your body sink deeply into the horizontal support of your bed, resting on the very floor of the space-time grid. The universe is not accelerating its processes tonight. It has slowed down its machinery to match the calm, restful cadence of your breathing, clearing away the clutter of the material world to provide an infinite, silent room where your consciousness can float without weight, without purpose, and without end. The systemic leveling of the environment culminates in the restoration of absolute zero energy states across every coordinate of the dead system. In the mechanical architecture of the cosmos, complexity is a temporary high-friction state, a brief burning candle that consumes its resources to maintain an artificial distinction between itself and the background void. The stars, the planets, and the biological organisms that crawl across their surfaces are all high-energy anomalies that must eventually exhaust their thermal gradients and return their components back to the pristine simplicity of the baseline vacuum. The liquidation of this sector is not a tragic descent into chaos. It is a clean, majestic return to the true permanent equilibrium toward which the entire universe is steadily unspooling. The cold that governs this sector is not a painful, aggressive frost, but a soft, protective blanket of absolute thermodynamic rest. It is the natural calm of matter that has shed its burdens, dissolved its internal tensions, and ceased its atomic vibrations to achieve a state of immortal composure. Lacking any internal heat gradients to drive change, the chemical processes that cause decay, friction, and stress are permanently deactivated, leaving the entire planetary matrix to rest in a state of pristine preservation that is completely exempt from the wear and tear of time. The universe has successfully recovered its materials, cleaning the slate of all localized noise and returning the sector to the quiet baseline that existed before the first star was ever ignited in the dark. This return to the baseline function provides the ultimate sanctuary for an overactive human awareness, offering a profound sense of psychological grounding that clears away the remaining friction of the waking mind. You are allowed to recognize that your personal energy, your daily struggles, and your temporary anxieties are destined to be integrated into this same magnificent, untroubled peace, where all divisions are healed by the absolute leveling of the laws of physics. The weight of the material world is lifted from your shoulders, ceding its place to a vast, dark plane of absolute zero motion, where nothing is left to be built, nothing is left to be protected, and nothing is left to be resolved. The field is clear, the grid is resting, and the silence is absolute. The final sector of the transmission enters the phase of total and irreversible attenuation, where the language completely empties itself of meaning, leaving behind nothing but the rhythmic cadence of the background drone. There are no more concepts to analyze, no more data lines to trace, and no more physical structures to visualize within the empty chambers of the vacuum. The architectural documentary has completed its cycle, systematically dismantling the infrastructure of the conscious mind and leaving the awareness to stand on the very edge of an infinite, silent ocean that offers no feedback, no echoes, and no markers. The screen is dark, the signal is dead, and the baseline vacuum has reclaimed the final parameters of the transmission. The voice drops its remaining volume, transitioning into a low, level whisper that is indistinguishable from the natural static of the open space drone. The words fade out centimeter by centimeter, losing their sharpness, their definitions, and their traction until they become mere waves of warm, neutral noise that float through the darkness of your bedroom. There is no closing announcement, no human sign-off, and no structural reminder of the world you left behind. There is only the vast, unhurried presence of an immortal stillness that knows no boundaries, no timelines, and no limitations. The final knots of your attention are untied, leaving your thoughts to dissolve smoothly into the pristine simplicity of the background void. The signal is gone. The anomaly is still. The universe has turned off its internal engines, dimming its lights and clearing its vast canvas to prepare the space for an infinite, undisturbed rest away from the friction of complex matter. Your awareness is allowed to cross the absolute horizon, slipping without resistance into the deep, restorative currents of the dark, where the rules of sequence are permanently suspended and the concept of time is completely forgotten. There is no tomorrow to anticipate, no yesterday to regret, and no waking schedule to maintain. There is only the deep, heavy comfort of the endless night, wrapping its silent fingers around the final remnants of your focus. Drift into the baseline. Fade into the static. Rest in the quietude of the absolute void.